Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Christopher Hawthorne. I'm the director of the third LA series at USC Dornsife and the chief design officer for the city of Los Angeles. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this event marking the 50th anniversary of Reyner Banham's Los Angeles, the Architecture of Four Ecologies, published in 1971. Since I too will be marking a 50th anniversary this year, I have a particular interest in this book and this anniversary, but it's also been, as a longtime architecture critic, of course, central to my thinking about Los Angeles in all kinds of ways. And in 2011, 10 years ago, it's remarkable to think that it was a whole decade ago, when I did a series at the LA Times where I was architecture critic until 2018, called Reading LA. I went back and read the canon of literature about the built environment of Los Angeles. This book, as one half of a sunshine noir dichotomy, which I'm sure is something we'll talk about today, really marks one of the two pillars of the post-war literature about Los Angeles and its built environment. This one, of course, on the sunshine side of that divide. So we're really pleased to have a terrific panel. And for me personally, to have a terrific co-host in David Yulin, to whom I'll throw it over in a second, my former colleague, longtime book critic at the Los Angeles Times and now teaching English here at USC. So let me begin with a couple of images just to take you through some basics about Reyner Banham. I've also asked all of the panelists to nominate a new ecology to kind of move the conversation forward a little bit as well. I think it's always important when doing these sorts of anniversary events to think about how we can look forward as well as back. And a model in that regard is a panel we did in 2015 as part of the third LA series on the 25th anniversary of Mike Davis's City of Quartz, which is the more pessimistic, the noir side of that sunshine noir dynamic that I was talking about. So we will use those new ecologies as a way to look to the 21st century city of Los Angeles. So a little bit of basic information on Banham before we get into the panel itself. Banham is approaching his centennial next year, but he was someone who really gave himself over to Southern California. This is a picture of him in the Mojave by Tim Street Porter. Began coming to Los Angeles in the late 1960s and famously writes in Four Ecologies that he learned to drive, as he put it, in order to read Los Angeles and the original. So ditching this fold-up bike that he was so well known for in London, in the desert, as it were, and moving into the automobility of Los Angeles. And then, by the 1980s, he has really gone fully native. This is a picture of John Muir School in Santa Monica. So this is a book that really caught the let's say the architectural and academic establishment by surprise in its optimistic reading of Los Angeles. This is the review by Roger Jelinek that appeared in the New York Times in the summer of 1971, not long after the book was published. And it's that headline that has really stayed famous in praise, exclamation point, of Los Angeles. So there was some surprise, of course, that an academic, a historian, a critic like Banham would come from London and find in Los Angeles a model in all kinds of ways for the city of the second half of the 20th century, although it's important to note that he is always at pains to remark about the specific nature of Los Angeles and read it on its own terms. It's pretty funny to think that when another famous book from the architectural canon, Learning from Las Vegas by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, was published, the following year, that headline was recycled atop another book review by the same critic, Roger Jelinek. And of course, that year, 72, Reyner Banham would go on to turn the book into a BBC documentary called Reyner Banham Loves Los Angeles, which features, among other amazing details, a billboard by the late great graphic designer Deborah Sussman, who came out of the Eames office and of course went on, along with John Jurdy and her partner Paul Preja, to produce many of the most significant designs for the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. But as we get into the book itself, one thing that I really want you to keep in mind is the structure. There is the structure of this book is quite unusual as nonfiction books about cities or about architecture go. So it's not just the four ecologies that I want to call your attention to here, but the way that these other chapters are threaded in between and among the four ecologies. And the way, in fact, that there are really five ecologies, if you think about that chapter 13 in Ecology for Architecture, which is really a tribute at the end of the book to the ways in which Los Angeles continues to be, or continued to be for Banham into the 70s, a really fertile landscape for new and innovative and forward-looking architecture. But these other chapters on the history of LA architecture, a note on downtown, chapter 10, because a note is all it deserved in Banham's eyes, the shortest chapter in the book. So I have found in doing that Reading LA series and thinking as David Yulin and our panelists have about the literature of cities, it's really unusual to have a nonfiction book of this type or work of criticism where in which the structure really underscores, supports the larger themes of the book. And it was that the particular themes that Banham was thinking about in structuring the book this way really had to do with this notion of the polycentric city, of course, which was becoming more and more kind of fixed idea about Los Angeles, this notion that you could move via random or Brownian motion over the whole area, that there was not that hierarchy of neighborhoods in terms of density or in other ways. And that the book itself is meant to be visited as Banham understood it in the same way that you could understand and move around Los Angeles. And that continues to be one of the really unusual aspects of the book. It was talked about here when it was published. It was given some pretty respectful coverage. Esther McCoy, really the woman who invented architectural criticism in Los Angeles, gave it a pretty favorable, mixed in some ways, but pretty favorable reading. There was one significant exception in a piece that really prefigured in many ways City of Quartz and the Mike Davis analysis of Los Angeles. Peter Plegans, who was a native of Southern California and went on to become the art critic of Newsweek, as well as he's also a very fine painter, published a piece in Art Forum more than a year after the book appeared. So this piece was in the December issue, I believe, of 1972 in Art Forum. Peter claims it's still the longest piece that Art Forum has ever published. I would have to fact check that claim, but it's a remarkably long and energetic, let's say, diatribe against the book, which ends with a famous line: "The trouble with Reyner Banham is that the fashionable son of a bitch doesn't have to live here." So a kind of attack on the book on behalf of natives of Los Angeles who couldn't dip in and out of the city in the way that he could. So that Art Forum piece, which actually is now available on the web, if you Google it, you can find it pretty easily. I recommend it to you, particularly those of you who know Four Ecologies, but haven't seen that Peter Plegans review from Art Forum. So our goal today is really to think about the place that the book has had in the architectural literature and the literature of Los Angeles, how that reception has changed over time, and really what the book means now, what it might mean now, what its blind spots were and continue to be, as we think about ecologies that might make more sense for the contemporary city, the 21st century Los Angeles. So let me hand it over to David Yulin. I wanted to ask you, David, to just say a few words about, as someone who has thought and written a lot about this literature of Los Angeles, where the book falls for you in that literature and how your sense of that maybe has changed over your time in Los Angeles.
Okay, great. Everybody can hear me okay? Thanks. First, I would just want to say thanks. Thank you, Chris, for bringing me into this discussion. I was part of that discussion about City of Quartz, whenever that was, 5-6 years ago. So it feels like I kind of like the bookmark aspect of that. And I think, you know, for me, that it's a complicated question. Partly it's the reader, I think about this book in the context of the literature and in the context of what it means to me as a reader and as a writer about Los Angeles. But I also think of the book, I'm not an architect, but I think a lot about cities. I've always lived in cities. I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about Los Angeles. So I also think about it actually in terms of the way I kind of practically move through the city in many ways. I want to talk first about a couple of antecedents. Banham often gets praised and has been praised by me and some often as a figure who is the sort of first person to come and look at Los Angeles on its own terms, rather than imposing a kind of European or East Coast sensibility on the city. I think that's largely true, but I teach this book and I teach literature of Los Angeles, and I think I just want to make a point about its relationship in some way to an earlier essay from the 1930s by James M. Cain called Paradise, which I think may actually be the first piece written by an outsider to take the city on its own terms. Cain kind of in a brilliant masterstroke opens that piece by essentially saying, take everything you've learned about Los Angeles and forget it, and suggests drawing a kind of map of Los Angeles using watercolors, and then extends the metaphor to suggest that by the time you're done making that map with the watercolors, the sun will have bleached the light and color out of the map, and you will have a kind of dun-colored map like the dun-colored hillside. And it's a beautiful metaphor. It does remind me kind of what Banham is doing. I think it's really important for us to think about this book in its historical context, its literary historical context. So as we just heard, the book, you know, Banham came to Los Angeles, you know, in the late 60s. The book came out in 1971. The mid-late 60s is a huge transitional point for Los Angeles as a city and Los Angeles as a kind of literary landscape. 1965 is the Watts riots. In the wake of the Watts riots, there are a number of cultural initiatives, including the Watts Writers Workshop that was founded by Bud Schulberg, that start to kind of open up that community, and then by extension other communities, to writing about Los Angeles from the inside. Prior to the mid 60s, there certainly was some inside game literature, but the vast overarching kind of framework for the literary treatment of Los Angeles was literature of outsiders, or the literature of exiles. Either people who came here for whatever reason grudgingly and were kind of compelled to stay and didn't want to be here, and were writing about the city through a kind of resentfully critical lens, or people, which we still see, who kind of parachute in. If you want to read, you want to see the examples of this, just read any cultural coverage about Los Angeles that's published in the New York Times, with the exception of that bagel piece that came out earlier this week. But, you know, people who will parachute in for a period of time and then kind of explain the city as if it is some kind of exotic landscape. I always sort of say, explain the city to the rubes who live here. I've often thought that if Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue or Newbury Street in Boston or Pennsylvania Avenue had palm trees on them, that there would be much less of a kind of culture of exoticism about Los Angeles from Eastern points of view. Banham arrives right in that zone, and I think it's really important because out of that writer's workshop in Watts came a number of signature talents, among them Wanda Coleman, who I think is one of the key transitional figures in the literature of Los Angeles. Just as a brief aside, Coleman was born in 1946, was raised in Watts. Her mother was a domestic for, among other people, in the 1940s and 50s, Ronald and Nancy Reagan, before the Reagan's political career. And so Coleman herself is kind of really interestingly situated in terms of having kind of access in some way, or limited access, but sort of mobility across social landscapes in the city. They kind of echo for me some of what Banham is talking about in terms of the sort of mobility, the actual physical mobility in terms of the city. Coleman turns Los Angeles literature into an inside game, right? She's writing about the city in which she was raised. She's writing about the city that has been both a source of possibility for her and also a source of extreme disappointment, even cruelty, in terms of some of the ways she was treated and some of the encounters she's had. And so she begins to write it, and she loves it because she loves it. I don't want to say in spite of the fact that she has trouble with it, but it's a complicated love. It's a real maturation, I think, of the way that writers start to look at the city on its own complicated terms. Coleman on the kind of psychological or emotional level, Banham in his way on the kind of physical street side level. And it illustrates to me a kind of maturation of the way that we as a kind of writers community are thinking about and engaging with the space, the physical and emotional space of the city. As I say, I don't think it's a coincidence that this happens at the same time. What Coleman brings is a real individual sensibility, and as I say, a kind of complicated, almost contradictory sense of the city. She inspires other writers to begin writing about their own experience in the city rather than playing off of the larger mythic structures of the city, speed and light, noir, sunshine noir. She's writing directly about personal experience and what it's like for individuals to live here. The importance of this can't be overstated in terms of the literature shifting to an inside, a kind of more three-dimensional sense of what it's like to be a resident. This is followed by, without getting too much into the weeds, in the late 60s and 70s by, writers like Bernard Cooper, who start coming into the territory and start writing about, writing what in other cities might be considered to be not particularly radical work, personal essays about, development of self, personal experience. But in Los Angeles, again, pushing against that mythic superstructure, they become kind of radical expressions of sort of individual identity within the city. So what I think one of the things that Banham brings to the game as a writer, and that is really important in terms of literature, is that the primacy of personal experience. One of the things that I find really fascinating about Four Ecologies is that for whatever else it is, it's a very personal book. He is reading the city through his own sort of movement through it. He's reading the city through his own kind of narrative of it. I think the structure is really important in that way. I agree. The idea that that downtown is the shortest chapter indicates the kind of the sprawl of the city, the kind of lack of primacy or lack of center of the city. And I think that that's a really important idea that is still kind of in play, even though we are now in a city where that is becoming much more centered, and where downtown is becoming much more of a kind of central axis or a central hub for the rest of the city. I think that there are a couple things in the book. I actually deal with, read the book a number of times, but I also deal with it in a way that Chris was suggesting, as a kind of, I dip in and out now when I look at it. And I was thinking as I was preparing these notes, which I was preparing over the last few days as I walk in the mornings, and as I was taking my walks. The key aspects for me are, the notion of the horizontal downtown, which is one of the ways he describes Mid-Wilshire. Which I think about because it's a neighborhood I live in, and it's a neighborhood I walk through all the time. The notion of the freeway as a kind of a neighborhood in its own way, and the plains of Id. I've always lived in the plains of Id the entire time I lived in Los Angeles. If I ever were to start a band, I would call it the plains of Id. I think that phrase is so brilliant in terms of talking about the kind of psychological hierarchies of neighborhoods and communities in Los Angeles. But for me, one of the takeaways is something that I think Banham wasn't exactly talking about, or wasn't talking about so overtly. And it comes back to the way he describes the freeway. One of the most telling images in the book for me, or one of the most resonant images in the book for me, is his notion of observing people as they are about to take the off-ramp from the freeway and re-enter the city, so to speak. Pulling down the visor and looking at the mirror and kind of fixing their hair or whatever, as if they're going outside. Banham used that in some ways to suggest that that the freeway and the car was kind of a home space, and that as you drove off of the freeway, you were re-entering the city in the way that you would when you left your house. You're checking the way you look before you re-enter the city. For me, I accept that, but I also want to push it a little farther. For me, it establishes this idea that I think is really important, which is that the freeways themselves are a kind of a neighborhood. The reason I find that as important is that thinking led me into kind of reimagining my own relationship to the city, not through the lens of sprawl, but through the lens of neighborhoods. I think it is very much a city of neighborhoods. I think it's actually a city of both. I think one of the compelling and contradictory things about Los Angeles is that everything we can say about it, every cliche about it is true, and equally true is the opposite of that cliche. And so for me, this notion of neighborhoods existing within Sprawl suggests something about the way the book continues to be important and continues to grow. I'm a walker and not a driver particularly. I drive almost entirely only under duress. So I've always felt that Banham kind of overstated the power of the car. Although if I'd been here in 1968 or 69 or 71, I might have felt differently. You know, everything, you know, what I know about the city from that era is that it was a lot easier to move around. My experience with Los Angeles in the current mode is that it's a terrible city to drive in and almost impossible to get around that way. But I think there is something really important and interesting about that notion of neighborhoods, of small communities. And as we kind of think about what this book's relevance is to us, again, I think it's the particularities. It's the real zeroing in on neighborhoods, the real zeroing in on physical space, and letting us think about it at the city, not simply as a kind of territory we move through as we move from one closed space to another closed space, but as a vibrant set of territories of its own.
David, I'm gonna ask you to pause right there if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And I want you to hold, if you have an ecology for us, if you hold that for a little bit.
That's the only thing I have left. So I'll stop for later.
Perfect. Because we did really want to have the perspective, a perspective from the UK, from London, from Banham territory. So we're really pleased to have Shumi Bose with us. And I will ask each of the panelists as I bring them on to introduce themselves. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do, your relationship to Banham, and then talk a little bit about this notion of the ecologies. Shumi.
Oh, thanks so much, Christopher. Thank you, David, for all of that sort of Banham sea wash that I feel like I'm in. Let me know if you're having trouble hearing me at all. Yeah, well, I primarily teach history and theory of architecture. I'm a historian, curator and editor, and a bit like Banham, I do lots of things around architecture, except I don't actually make it happen. Based in London, and I teach at Central St Martin's on the BA architecture course. I have 350 undergraduates in my care, and I teach at the Royal College of Art too. But I mean, that's all the, let's say, literally academic stuff. I have to confess that I'm a bit of an imposter on this panel. Maybe we all feel like that to some extent. I think despite his chipper, confident tone and pretty impeccable scholarship, I'd say almost impeccable scholarship, I think maybe Banham felt like a bit of an imposter too. But maybe we can speculate on that later. Really, I have no particularly scholarly claim to Banham. Sorry, I just forgot to put my timer on. In fact, my closest relationship to Banham, as I've discussed with the panel on a sort of daily frequency, is that in one way or another, his works, their titles and so on, form the basis of most of my passwords. And so it's a kind of very intimate relationship, if kind of mundane or quotidian, that I have crafted with Banham. And it's kind of, you know, it's abstract and personal in its meaning and significance. I'm offering this as a kind of parallel to my even more abstract relationship to Los Angeles, given that I'm thousands of miles away in London and that I've never in fact visited LA. I'll come as soon as I can. So on this panel, I'm not going to be historiographic. There are my panelists to help me sort of discuss in that sense. My kinship.
Did we lose Shumi? Oh, there you are. Please, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, I was saying, my kinship with Banham is too strong. I'm too buzzed with things that are going on. And I think he would be too. And it's not that I don't have energy for a scholarly discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. But as he did often, I'm deciding not to have one. I will be personal and intimate, even if I'm describing this strangely superficial relationship with Banham. So on the one hand, it's personal. On the other hand, my attempts to look at his work are with my students, whom I carry with me all the time. So just indulge me on the personal part. A lot of things separate me from Banham, and did from most historians when I was a student. There's evident differences between us, certain socio-structural barriers, maybe. Although when and where I grew up, I didn't really recognize those things as social barriers. I might now, but I didn't then. Still, my partner of many years will remember me moaning how unfair it is that I'm not going to grow up to be one of these guys. I'm never going to grow a beard like these guys. I'm not even remotely convincing on a Brompton, and I'm just never going to have the gravitas to smoke a pipe, that might happen. But the funness or kinship with Banham, maybe unlike some of the other historians and scholars that I had to study, I'm trying to work it out. Banham was a bit of a hero, and I'm trying to figure out why that is. It must be in some part because he's sort of inconceivably groovy for an architecture historian, and certainly for a British architecture historian. And, you know, a lot of that is obviously drawn from his relationship to, you know, the fabled West Coast, fabled to me, and his studies of California and Los Angeles in a kind of scholarly way in the Four Ecologies, but also in the kind of more pop-tastic Reyner Banham loves Los Angeles, which I continue to enjoy with my students. I wonder if it's that kind of irreverence and slippage that reconciles me to this particular scholar. I think it is. I think I broke it down so much for myself at the time. I remember flirting a little bit mentally with his teacher. That's what brown girls do, I think, when we're studying, what this one did, studying architectural historians. I kind of mentally have conversations with them like, oh, I remember thinking, Pevsner, you in radio, 1955, that's pretty cool. But with Banham, it's this double edge of being incredibly scholarly, but also that he laid out his rhetoric not only in Architectural Review and lots of other disciplinary journals, but also for things like The New Statesman, The New Society, Living Arts, The Listener, Zodiac, this kind of roving liquid path that I find really liberating and continue to find really liberating. The sort of polymathic kind of enthusiasm which Banham was sort of doing his career, it seems like not such a bad cause to me, and hopefully not too divergent from what I aspire to do myself, which is working quite hard to keep having architectural conversations, or having conversations in which I'm involving myself in lots of different areas, much like he did. Education, yes, cultural production, curation, social justice, translating, not just as a way to guarantee income, but as a real practice, or a kind of as a practice philosophy. You could think about it as coalition building if you wanted to co-opt that phrase. I probably shouldn't. But Banham's kind of refusal to fit and the difficulty in disciplining this figure, I like it. He's what he is to the academy and what he is to the street. I appreciate that model. I was going to read out a little bit, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to point out a sort of parallel, because I've been enjoying swinging from thing to thing like Banham did. And forgive me for not quoting for now from the Four Ecologies, but I was thinking about the essay, The City is a Scrambled Egg, which Banham did write, I think with Los Angeles in mind, and some other American sprawling cities as well. So the city is a scrambled egg with the shell broken and the business yolk mixed with the sort of residential district, everything spread across the landscape. Reading this or rereading this took me immediately to a little passage from Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic. Don't roll your eyes if you've, had enough of this being, thrown at you. It works. The little scene in Audre Lorde's essay in the Uses of the Erotic about the pellet of yellow in the margarine spreading throughout the kind of white manufactured industrial margarine seemed to me in line with what Banham was saying, and in line with what I now think of as critique and the writing of history and the pursuit of architectural conversations. So the ecology that I'd like to propose would be an ecology of the erotic. After Lorde.
Thank you so much, Shumi. A terrific way to start. And I want to get back to this question of the difficulty of disciplining Banham, and I'm curious if that still seems the case, or I know you're sort of finding something to praise there. I just wonder if he still seems that way vis-a-vis the Architectural Academy. Let me turn next to Joe Day. We're really pleased to have him here. As he will tell you, he wrote the the forward to one of the most recent edition of Banham's book on Los Angeles. I'm joining a great literature in that sense, and very curious to hear his thoughts this afternoon. Joe.
Thank you, Christopher. Let me get my screen shared here. And I'd just like to thank Christopher and David and Shumi. That was a pleasure. I look forward to talking more and see if I get this rolling. Oh, just briefly, my name is Joe Day. I'm an architect and theorist in Los Angeles. I teach at SciArc, and I have a practice, Deacon Day Design and Architecture. But it is the case that I'm here today because Los Angeles, the architecture of the four ecologies, has factored into my life in a lot of wonderful ways. It was the Banham's wonderful shot of the 10405 freeway was the site of my undergraduate thesis, and my son is named Reyner Day. So I'm vested. But let me start here. Whatever else you can say about Reyner Banham's Los Angeles, the architecture of four ecologies, we must grant its staying power. With Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays, published a year before, it never really fades away. Both books and the Los Angeles of 50 years ago still seem to hover on our collective horizon, not unlike the smog-inflected sunsets that defined both the allure and danger of the city then. Art and architecture in Los Angeles both began to accelerate in the 1970s, down rather different but occasionally intersecting routes. It's odd to think that as Frank Gehry was beginning to refashion his own home by tearing it open, Chris Burden, the author of the beloved Urban Lights and Metropolis installations at LACMA, was talking friends into shooting him with a rifle and then making TV ads about it. A helter-skelter time, but also one of huge cultural advance. Since then, discussions of culture have themselves become freighted. In the 1990s and aughts, the discussion of Banham was often framed in terms of competing voices and points of view. I remember a design conference in the early 90s that included this bon mot from Banham's rival, Robert Venturi. For people of culture and taste, Los Angeles didn't exist before Reyner Banham. He said that in a panel discussion at the Pacific Design Center. But Banham knew how far west both culture and taste had moved. In his last chapter, which is itself, as Christopher noted, an additional ecology for architecture, Banham had this response to condescension from Europe and points east. Los Angeles does not get the attention it deserves. It gets attention, but it's like the attention that Sodom and Gomorrah have received, primarily a reflection of other people's bad consciences. And I include here the next paragraph on his retort to Corbusier, which I think is sort of a nice play on how to imagine urban futures. My forward followed Anthony Vidler's brilliant one for the previous edition, and actually both are included in the latest. So, but please, Tony's is incredible. Vidler's introduction, and even more so his histories of the immediate present, explain how revolutionary LA A for E, and that's the insider shorthand for this one, was for contemporary architecture and the writing of it. His idea of a freeway history in which cities and architecture might be newly imagined through a looping 60-mile-per-hour windshield montage was game-changing, actually in both urbanism and architecture. And Banham's futurist, this is a timeline of Reyner Banham's books and Colin Rowe. Colin Rowe, within the field of architecture, is considered Banham's closest contemporary and rival, and incredibly parallel for being another British expat who, however, didn't venture much into the Western United States. Taught at Cornell for many years after Texas, is considered really the godfather of American formalism. But Banham's futurist enthusiasm and his rival Colin Rowe's cubist declensions define the poles of contemporary US architecture for most of these last 50 years. And I would add that last week there was a conference hosted in Ohio called Black Boxing Banham, if any of you are interested in the insider baseball of how Banham really does help architects rethink what's possible for their field. It was a fantastic discussion. Much of it had to do actually with the repeated title here, Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, which turns out to be a very, very big and contentious book for technologists trying to imagine better performing buildings. Like a freeway, some of the staying power of LA A for E may well have to do with its open-endedness. The game of adding ecologies is a storied one, as Christopher and David made clear. Ecologies of evil and fear have proved enduring, but I'm torn now between two more. One of the moment and of my own invention, an ecology of density, and another that has been vastly undercredited, Margaret Crawford's Ecology of Fantasy, which she coined between those of Blachins and Davis in 1988. Rereading Margaret's pithy and still very timely 8-page pamphlet for the Los Angeles Forum of Architecture and Urban Design, I find that perhaps ecologies of density and fantasy overlap more than I'd have thought. Disneyland's opening in 1955 is the moment for her ecology, in which micro worlds replace the actual. But it is car culture, Crawford points out, which enabled so many theme environments since, for entertainment, shopping, sports, and much else. And entertainment is a far larger and more varied part of the economy now. When one thinks in the 1980s, actually aerospace and real estate both far outstripped entertainment as a portion of LA's economy. And now, if you include the new economies of gaming and dot-coms, that Los Angeles has really been redefined by that and by the resurgence of our port, which actually was my preoccupation when I wrote my introduction. Rereading, pardon me. Crawford argues that the effects are both diverting and insidious, as the real cityscape is increasingly left only to those that can't afford the simulacra, the many excluded by race and class, and especially the homeless. As we rush to build out the city at 4 to 8 stories, we are altering the basic morphology of Los Angeles no less dramatically than did Paris under Baron Haussmann. Will our thickened plains of id rise as a class-striated layer cake, a unifying souffle, or more like a 1970s casserole of dubious pedigree? Density and fantasy will indeed be intertwined. When I was asked to add to Los Angeles, my first thought took the shape of that diagram, the diagram on the right. I was just trying to get my head around how LA had played out in 40 years. But this one is actually, that one sort of fleshed out over a couple of years. This includes about 100 LA movies, still polarized by sunshine and noir and realism and fantasy. I should credit Paulette Singley's dirty realism for the realism corner of it, but I will claim Palm Calm and the Horizon of Misspent Youth as my own. And with that, thank you very much. I will pass it on to Victor, I think. Or back to Chris.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. And I love that notion of the thickened plains of id, and I want to come back to that idea as well. But yes, we turn next to Victor, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, David. It's wonderful to be here, and I also feel quite privileged to be in such great company on a Thursday morning pre-spring. I am the graduate coordinator and director of the Masters of Architecture program at Cal Poly Pomona. I have a long-standing interest in the architecture, its intersection with infrastructure and the urban experience. And so it's great to be thinking about these things with regard to the ecologies and Reyner Banham. I'm going to ask to share the slides that I've presented, and I want to talk about a few issues here that have been very close to me given the kind of context that we're living in. I think for me, one of the things that my relationship with Banham and the book goes back to as a young student at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo when I was studying architecture there. And being completely mesmerized and charmed by not only Reyner Banham himself as this kind of distant figure that I had seen images of, and also and reading the book, but also this idea that he was just so cool. I think a little bit of Allen Ginsberg for me, a little bit of Charles Bukowski, and a little bit of Steve McQueen, as we can see in this series of images of Reyner himself. Just switch to the next image. Looking and thinking about the kind of forces in play, how the fact that Banham was coming to Los Angeles and with the express intent of kind of declaring that Los Angeles is this great city, and thinking about the context of those circumstances, how he came here. One, drawing quite a bit from his associations with other expats and other foreigners that were living and practicing in Los Angeles, whether they be painters like David Hockney, whose image is featured here on the cover of the publication in 1971, or his acknowledgement to Cedric Price, who he attributes having been the person who encouraged him to go to Los Angeles, but also some of the people that are referenced inside of the book itself, Schindler, Neutra, Ed Ruscha, to name a few, and also beginning to try to understand the relationship with the institution of USC, who had invited him and actually offered him a teaching position and lodging at the Gamble House by Green and Green in Pasadena during his initial stay in the late 60s. Next slide, please. So thinking back at this, one of the things that, and thinking about the current circumstances of Black Lives Matter, and having a better understanding of who and what I am and people like myself are, their relationship to the practice of architecture and to architectural history, and many of the things that Shumi had talked about. I feel similarly that I would, as much as I was completely enamored and charmed by Reyner Banham, I never thought of myself as being able to be someone who could achieve that kind of influence. And I think a lot of that, now that we are at a turning point in our kind of cultural narrative, has to do with the absence of, or the omission of Black identity, the Black experience, or cultural practice in the book. And so next slide, please. So I'm gonna maybe go off topic for a couple of seconds, because so much of that really comes back to a question that James Baldwin posited during his, as a kind of rebuttal statement during his debate with Lee Buckley at Cambridge University in 1965. He says, "It comes as a great shock to discover that the discipline," and I'm riffing off of this, "that the discipline of architecture to which my brown-faced brothers and sisters have pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to us. It's like rooting, as James Baldwin would say, it's like rooting for Gary Cooper killing off the Indians, only to discover later that we, as the brown people, are the Indians." And so there's that thought that somehow Reyner Banham actually had no interest in the Black experience, and that's pure speculation, but also by the omission or absence and referencing of creatives in the book leads one to think that that was very much, that was not part of his preoccupation. And then the next slide, please. In kind of referencing this idea of omission or oversight is perhaps it was maybe too difficult to talk about those things during a period which was just, kind of in the middle of a kind of civil rights movement, or at the tail end of the civil rights movement, that it would maybe be too distracting, too difficult of a topic to talk about these kinds of cultural and identity aspects of Los Angeles, and not be able to do what the book really was intended to do, which was to outrageously declare Los Angeles as a great city. And so maybe this image really of Marlon Brando and James Baldwin is, for me, a kind of similarly talks about how one, or how the writing and thinking of history often omits topics that are too difficult, too complicated, that are not easily factored into the kind of dominant narrative that that so often dictates what is recorded in history and what is not. And so this relationship between this supposed intimate relationship between James Baldwin and Marlon Brando is often something that is never really discussed about with regard to either of these figures, but is nonetheless something that was there. The next slide, please. And I think that this set of images, one on the left is a life expose documenting Watts just after the riots, the 60s revolt in Watts, and then on the right is the actual a picture in Watts that's in the book that shows Watts without the presence of human life. And so I think this rupture between the absence or omission of is best illustrated here. I'm looking at these two images. Next slide, please. And I think about those people and those individuals that were very much part of the cultural production of the time. I'm thinking about Nora Purifoy, Judson Powell, even going back earlier and thinking about the John Elgin Wolfe and his Hollywood Regency, or Betty Sayer. The absence of these individuals' names in the book seems a bit alarming. Or if we go to the next slide, which focuses on the architects, Paul Williams and his incredible contribution to the built environment of Los Angeles, Clyde Grimes or Robert Kennard. And so realizing that these people that I would identify with based on color and also their interest in creative practice are not in the book or have been omitted or overlooked in the book comes as a great shock to me. And the last slide, I think it really speaks to the question of the kind of preciousness of the real estate of the index, and was the real estate of the index the area, the space that might be allowed for these 6 names that I've just mentioned and perhaps others. Is there not enough space on the page? Was there not enough opportunity to include these people, or did it complicate the issue of valorizing Los Angeles by talking about these very kind of polemical topics of race, culture, and identity? So rather than suggest a new ecology or another ecology be added into the book, I would say that my interest is in buffing up the ecologies that already exist, and that buffing up would lead us to be more mindful of these omissions that I've just spoken about. Thank you.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Victor. And we will turn next to Gia and Rosario, who will present together. But before we do that, let me just say to all of you in attendance, if you have questions that you would like the panel to consider, like me to put to the panel, please, you should feel free to start putting them in the Q&A box. There's already one about the Paradise essay that David mentioned. I think it's James M. Kane is the author, but we'll get back to David in a little bit. But if you have questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and I will turn to Gia and Rosario.
Victor, that was such a great presentation, and I would love to pick up on some of those threads. Rosie and I are right now, we're co-curators on a project or an exhibition in an institution that I'm myself new to, which is the Mack Center for Art and Architecture. I was recently appointed director earlier this year. My name's Gia Gu. I'm an architectural historian, curator, and educator. And I also run a small architecture practice, Spina Gu. And I teach history theory as a visiting faculty at CCA. So bio aside, I will say maybe not to date myself, but I think maybe with Shumi, a younger generation of practitioners that are reading Banham. And as somebody that grew up in Los Angeles, in some of those plains of Id valleys, San Gabriel Valley and San Fernando Valley, I grew up in Los Angeles walking through LA with a different lens. And thinking about Victor's point, reading Ginsberg and Bukowski and Banham resonating, my literature was Diane de Prima and Salman Rushdie. So I'm curious to talk later about what it means to walk through the city and to travel through the city with a different kind of gaze, and what would be the gaze of the next generation. I'm going to let Rosie introduce herself, and then we'll move into what our ecology proposition is.
Yeah, thank you, Gia. Hello, I'm Rosario Televi. I am an architect and curator from Buenos Aires, and I've been living in Berlin for the last 10 years. And currently I divide my time between the Floating University, which is a nature culture learning site, and Soft Agency, that is a diasporic group of female spatial practitioners. So I work across space, pedagogies, and feminisms. And my connection to Reyner Banham's and this particular book was through my studies. I studied architecture in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And we had this amazing class called Urban Morphology, where we basically explored the question of what shapes the city. And this would be like from buildings to politics to social phenomena. And in the course, this book, but also the movie that I think Shumi also mentioned, was introduced to us. And you should try to imagine what that meant to us, this kind of cool English intellectual cruising LA in a car and gazing that from Buenos Aires, which is a city, and not Argentina, but specifically Buenos Aires, and even more the School of Architecture, obsessed with Europe and the States, always looking north. And the book, and so the movie, became kind of this distant, faraway cult classic among my peers. And since then, I think I lost touch, let's say, with the book and with Reyner. But yeah, I'll pass it back to you, and let's nominate our ecology.
Yes, if my computer will work. Hold on. There we go. So we were brought in by Christopher because we were working already on an exhibition titled Ecologies and Ecologies of Care. This is something Rosie and I have been working on since 2019. Did not realize a pandemic was coming, and now this term care has really taken on a kind of global circulation. And so in our nomination of an Ecologies of Care, what we want to center on is not to think, well, let's say, how to think about care beyond the interpersonal and the self, and how to think about care as it encounters systems. So how to infuse care in planetary scale processes and systems. So Ecologies of Care is a project that will take the form of a public program at Mack Center in the fall 2022 that investigates perspectives of care in architecture and environments. The term ethics of care has had really wide circulation, especially recently, in areas of feminist theory, artistic research, political theory, moral philosophy, and yet in architecture, understanding care as a form of discourse as well as labor carries less reverberation, despite the fact that architecture has historically and theoretically articulated itself as an art derived from the necessity of shelter. In other words, as an act of care. So in our project, what we're trying to do is think about care as a site where representation, labor, and ethics are intertwined. Theories of care originated in the articulation of gender's effects on labor, politics, and ethics, but recently contemporary thinking about or theorizing care has really extended to large-scale human and non-human processes, and we'll show a few examples. But essentially, we'll be thinking through these questions of how to infuse care into systems and working with a number of Los Angeles-based and international collaborators, including this image here of TAC, which is an architecture duo in Barcelona and Madrid that are working and thinking about architectures that can be a repository for human and non-human actors. I think I'll skip a few things on this because we have not so much time. So I'll pass this to Rosie.
Yes. So as Gia was saying, we were having this conversation around care long before the pandemic. And when I say we, I mean us with Gia, but I also want to acknowledge a lineage of feminist thinkers and makings from the 60s onwards. So what do we mean when we talk about care? It was in the 90s that John Tronto introduced the concept of care into political philosophy and argued for care as a basis for radical political judgments. So this ethics of care challenge us to construct social relationships and systems based on relational and situational morality, beyond abstract or universal notions of justice. So these theories and practices, because they're both of cares, what they offer us is ways of relating and living, of perceiving and making, both as a society, but also as individuals engaged in what Tonto coined mutual responsibility, attentiveness, and responsiveness. And when we bring these concepts from political philosophy into or towards the production of space, architecture, and city making, which have historically set their agendas driven by fast-paced growth, innovation imperatives, solution-oriented demands, we see a pressing need to ensure that we recognize care and maintenance, repair in guises other than the traditional normative association. Meaning normally care is very much associated with a welfare state, with the health industry and gender connotations, which have been inherited through Eurocentric thinking and of course the modernist ethos, which is still very much ingrained and rooted in us. So maybe some of the questions that we would like to address through the exhibition and through the public program is how we might understand modes of care and repair cultures as being fundamental ways of doing otherwise. And thinking further, how might this support spatial practitioners to redefine values upon which they produce architecture and the built environment? And maybe if we want, trying to bring this to Banham, because perhaps he was looking towards other ways of doing outside of the traditional confines of the profession, no? Maybe beyond the academic world. Maybe here we could maybe think about and discuss further in the discussion. But before I hand it back to Gia, I would like to return to care with one more thought, which I think connects nicely to the images and the project that Gia will show, which is basic as Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's notion of care. Puig de la Bella Casa reframes the human as a caretaker. So she brings this idea of a custodial figure in an ongoing recuperation of the planet and people. And she argues that to care is to recognize a certain fragility between the bonds that holds us humans with non-humans, and that practicing care asks us to cultivate a set of skills and sensitivities that maintain and sustain all kinds of life. And Gia, with that last phrase,
I will close out thinking about Banham again and how he writes and what he writes about his methods of writing. Banham was thinking about Los Angeles through 4 territories, and he was, moving interdisciplinarily, but really moving almost like an anthropologist or ethnographist or ethnographer, and really mapping human activity onto the built environment. So to extend Banham in 50 years after his writing, one of the things we might think about is how we can think about architecture beyond merely the human scales of time, beyond the time scale of buildings, and think about these constructions of nature versus culture as themselves, a social construction that we can find opportunities to extend or circumvent. So 2 practices we just wanted to bring in as an example of this would be cooking section on the left and year month date on the right. So cooking section, they produce a project in current LA's triennial, 2 years ago. And their project essentially explores the systems that organize the world through food. And in this particular case, what they were looking at were the muscles of the body and the muscles, as in the bivalves that exist off the coastal shore of California, and how they interact with one another, thinking about the kinds of toxins and chemicals we're putting into our bodies in order to shape them, and then what comes out through the sewage waste system, and what are the systems of care, like these active digestive machines, which are the muscles, how these muscles actually clean our pollutants for us. And then thinking about that in the ecology of Venice Beach. And on the right-hand side is year, month, date. They're thinking about how to understand buildings beyond the human timeline, and thinking about building culture through a geological timeline. So a lot of their work is looking at certain material cultures like gravel, sand, small rocks, and thinking about production cycles, and essentially thinking about the building not as the instantiation of material, but the building as just one cycle within a lifespan of materials themselves. So how is a sand aggregate, you might think of that as an origin point, but actually the building merely becomes like a slice of this life of the sand over thousands of years or a millennia, and how sand turn into buildings, and how buildings then get returned back into sand over time. So maybe I'll just wrap up, I guess I'll bring the panelists back in, but thinking about what Victor was talking about and presenting, and Joe and Shumi and David, we're kind of in, sorry, not to take over Christopher's job, but we're kind of in this moment.
No, please do.
We're kind of in this moment, especially in architectural history, where we're thinking about like, what is global architectural history? What are the new subject positions people are taking? And what does it mean to write and construct and maintain legacies? And I really appreciate the panel, and we're so grateful to Christopher for having invited us, because I can see that he's really been thinking through the many voices that can talk about, legacy construction and maintenance. And I say this because next year we're celebrating 100 years of Schindler. So that's really on the top of my mind, right? What it means to think through history and interpret history today.
It's a great segue back to the panel. I just want to thank everyone for those fantastic presentations. We have about 25 minutes left, and I think that the way that you framed that last thought, Gia, is really significant. I've just been working with a group of historians and architects and others on a mayor's office civic memory working group, thinking about these same questions about commemoration, how we would approach difficult anniversaries like the 30th anniversary of 1992 next year, for example, or this year, the 150th anniversary of the 1871 anti-Chinese massacre, which is one of the worst episodes of racial violence in California history, and we have barely begun to grapple with in a broad way. But I suppose that, yeah, that leads to a question about, I think the blind spots of the book are numerous, and many of you have articulated them quite powerfully, particularly those of you who are native Angelenos, saying that it has not reflected your experience of walking through, moving through, or growing up in the city. And I'm curious, given that, what explains the book's staying power? Does it deserve that staying power? Will we be revisiting it in 25 or 50 years? I think, so to piggyback on Gia's really good question, let me open that up to all of the panelists.
I don't want to jump in, but I will. I do think we'll still be reading Banham in 50 years. I mean, oddly, I think Banham's read more at 50 than he was at 25. I think there's been a resurgence of interest in Banham, and I do think his point of view, has ended up incredibly fluid and flexible in terms of the structure of his argument and the way of seeing cities, and the degree to which cities have evolved more like Los Angeles than a lot of other cities around the world. But I'm not concerned about Banham's valence in 50 years, but I do think the blind spots that we're talking about today will, and hopefully they start to move away. I was thinking about an Ecology of Care, and I was wondering if his original ecologies, if one can find some pattern of amelioration in say, his portrayals of Surfurbia and the Foothills and the Plains of Id, and even frankly in Autopia, which certainly Joan Didion saw as a huge release and relief from everything she was driving through. I do think I think for Banham, Banham's love of Los Angeles was actually, you know, a certain kind of generalized ecology of amelioration that he felt. And Shumi, I was thinking through your talk that Anthony Vidler these days is preoccupied by Banham and class, that he came from Norwich, which I'm trying to pronounce properly, and that he was a scholarship kid at the grammar school and found himself in academia always confronted, especially in the UK, by his betters and frustrated by it. And Los Angeles was a huge relief from that. But I think it's important to realize that for him and for Aldous Huxley and Evelyn Waugh before him, the degree to which Los Angeles presented itself as classless and you know, just incredibly freeing from their point of view depended on not seeing the vast class striations that made Los Angeles possible then and continue to now, that are often coded, you know, often coded in color.
Just to pick up on Joe's point, I think, yeah, there's an interesting thing that happens with Banham when he writes Los Angeles into visibility, which is, you know, I don't know if you guys have, I'm sure everyone's heard of saying, I came to see Los Angeles, but I couldn't find it. And so I think, you know, that if you think about the act of writing as a mode of care, that certainly is something that he's engaging with. And I just think making things that have been invisible for a long time visible is part of what is his attraction, right?
Jumi, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, these are discussions that I encourage in my classes, and design tutors don't come to my classes, so we can kind of do what we want. So yeah, we do talk about these blind spots, and maybe because I teach undergraduates, yeah, I'm less hung up on why they occurred and more excited about the possibilities that remain. I mean, I'm more excited about all the work that there is ahead to do. Like, look at all these ways of looking that no one bothered to write about. How, I mean, okay, to think about why, because I try and be as, well, again, because I teach undergraduate, I'm keen not to polemicize or dogmatize too much. And so we might ask ourselves about things like access. Perhaps Banham didn't have access to the sorts of things that we're missing. And if I know him from his writing, he's not one to talk about things unless he can really, really kind of get into it. Why that might have been the case, why he didn't feel. Another thing that I think is kind of something that's reverberating with my students is the sort of permission to talk about things, the permission to care about things. I mean, Banham himself gave us permission to care about all sorts of plastic crap that we didn't really think was worthy. No, and now people can say, well, Banham did it. So, and Banham, you know, liked LA, so we're allowed to. And similarly, you know, we have permission to talk about things like care in the academy and to talk about, honestly, why people can't access things, why people feel uncomfortable to talk about things. There's so much to be done. So yeah, that's where I am with it.
Mm-hmm. And that notion of the kind of class freedom from a kind of class dynamic, does that ring true for you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't know about, for me personally, there are other dynamics, I think, but I can totally imagine that for Banham, and hence my mention of the sort of imposter syndrome at the beginning, partly to do with class, partly to do with wanting to be a pilot, not being able to, talking about architecture, not being an architect, all sorts of ways in which this sort of fringy position might have fueled exactly the sorts of things that particularly I admire about his operation. Yes, there could have been other things he could have done. Sure, I can do them.
Fascinating, you know, because I think that class is central in a lot of ways to the Los Angeles narrative, although it's portrayed otherwise. You know, I mean, I've got students here, and we were just reading Mildred Pierce, which I think is sort of the great class novel of Southern California, right? It's, you know, it's a novel about the class war between Pasadena and Glendale, among whatever else it is. But I think that you don't really see that from the outside. And I, you know, as an East Coast transplant, I would say similarly, perhaps. You know, I used to joke that one of my favorite things about Southern California was that nobody asked where I went to college. And I think there is a kind of allure of classlessness, a kind of veneer level of sort of that the city doesn't operate on class, doesn't operate through a filter of class. I think it actually operates very strongly through a filter of class, but I think you have to be here for a while and kind of see, either as someone who grew up here, but as someone who comes here, I think you have to be here for a while to see below the kind of surfaces of the city, to see what those dynamics are.
And one thing we haven't really touched on too much, although sort of glancingly, I suppose, is the way in which the book is really, of course, all about Los Angeles and not about Los Angeles at all, in the sense that Banham was really looking to reinvent or turn architectural history upside down, and saw, of course, being as perceptive as he was, saw in Los Angeles a vehicle to do that. And I'm wondering, those of you who are thinking about this kind of emerging literatures in the way that Gia and Rosario, that you talked about in particular, but would open this up to everyone. What are the new modes of sort of reorganizing that or changing the frame? Is it through a city? Is it through, what are the kind of subjects that the writers that you find most interesting are using to perhaps do something similar to what Banham did?
Can I answer with a question? Because that was actually what I was thinking when you mentioned, I think in our preparatory meeting, that since Four Ecologies and then Mike Davis, City of Quartz, that since then nothing correspondingly has been published about Los Angeles urbanism. I was wondering if, I'm not a historian, so I tend to look towards the future and the present, I guess. If we could shift our attention to these other stories. So who's writing today the counter canon in LA? What are the LA's less heard urban histories? And to acknowledge those and therefore amplify perhaps these less heard voices. But maybe this is a question as a stranger, as a foreign,
Question. Yeah.
I'd maybe add to that, just to add another layer of it, of who's listening. No? I think that has a lot to do with what we hear and what we read and what we see, is like who's actually interested in these things and what's behind that interest. And there are many types of interests. No, there's commodifying, exploitative kind of interests, and there's other interests that perhaps, again, are willfully secluded, or and so there's so many different ecologies to kind of excavate in this. I'm just enjoying wordplay now.
I'd love to jump in here, because I think one of the things that's one, go back to the earlier question of whether we will be reading Banham in 10, 15, 20 years. I definitely think we will be. I think that what Reyner Banham holds for us as a kind of a real staying power is, one, leaving the kind of known territories and going out into areas that were not necessarily explored or seen as not as productive places for learning. And so I think that lesson still more than ever holds tremendous potency as we think about the practice of architecture and the writing of architecture, where there's this real confrontation today about it not being just in the service of the privileged. And so this idea, like learning from Las Vegas, that there are histories and stories that can be, that are of relevance, I think is key to what Banham was all about. I think also for me, it speaks about the kind of symptomatic condition of the times that he was living in and working in. I think it speaks critically to the institutions that supported his research. It's very strange how A.C. Martin emerges in and out of the book. I think some of that has to do with the deep kind of, connections that USC as an institution has to the A.C. Martin family. And
Pereira as well in the same way.
And Pereira and Gruen. But I think most importantly is that what is the ill consequences of these omissions that I spoke about earlier? And I think about particularly Paul Williams. And I think about a missed opportunity there, both in terms of, expanding one's understanding of architecture as an inclusive mode of practice, but then the history of Paul Williams, not only as an architect to the stars, but someone who had dedicated his entire life to the idea of affordable housing and social housing. And so for me, these omissions, they not only compromise the ability to imagine mentorship for young brown or people of color to find like inspirations, they also kill incredible bodies of knowledge that would otherwise support research. We're getting out of a pandemic. The issue of housing and affordability is going to be at the forefront of that conversation. How do architects productively glean from experiences through history and through vast information that much of it has been kind of pushed away from the side because it doesn't have the glamour. So for me, it's about bringing those histories back and pushing them into the conversation because they are so essential to so many of the topics that we will be dealing with as practitioners in the near future, present, and moving forward. The issue of ecology is another, for example.
Right, it's such an important point because for all the affability, the charisma, the prose, and I really think that explains more than anything else why we keep reading it, just because the writing itself is so charismatic. But for all that kind of affability and self-deprecating, tone of the book, it does aspire to map the territory entirely in that structure that I showed at the beginning. It's incredibly hubristic or ambitious, pick your word. It does say this is the entire landscape, and I've threaded through all these layers. So those blind spots that you've all pointed out are all the more, they stand out all the more. And so I think that's a super important point. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to turn to questions from the audience, but I love what Shumi said in the chat, that if we're talking about this relationship between the UK and Southern California and the peculiarities of it, that interview that we all watched with Oprah in Montecito on the terrace was another chapter, I suppose, in that ongoing saga. Excellent. So, is that a question from Anna Shumi that we should turn to?
I was trying to coax one out of her. I don't know if she would like to, or if she's able to be to sort of say it herself.
Turn her camera on, but if she can put some version of it in the Q&A, will be.
This was, I believe Anna showed this project at the Schindler House last year, perhaps, or a year or two ago. And Charles Jenks, it was one of my last exchanges with Professor Jenks was to let him know and to send a few shots that I think actually eased a very tough few weeks for him. But let me just
verbalize the question, because I think we can see chat, but not all the audience can. I was sort of having a parallel discussion with Anna Katz, who's in the conversation here, but maybe busy at work or something. And we were thinking about why it is that there is this blindness, and certainly a sort of will to render a very small piece of the city as representative, and thereby kind of obscuring or wiping out or choosing not to care about certain identities and certain ways of dwelling in space. And in our discussion, she was paralleling this with Charles Jenks' studies of residences in LA and how they're similarly sort of blind, if you like. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
No, actually, Shumi, I'm glad you interrupted me, because it was another project I was thinking of about those houses of Charles Jenks. But maybe for today, what's pertinent, Charles Jenks's word on Banham was interesting, and he was famously his most famous thesis Banham's most influential thesis advisee so far. When I asked him about Banham, he paused for a little while. He said, you know, Banham was chippy. And I had to sort of take that in. But I do think it's important, and this is another reason why he'll keep being read, Charles Jenks's undoing of Banham through postmodernism and through a kind of, you know, intellectually, they really ended up at odds. Banham didn't like Jenks's work, wasn't interested in a resurgent fascination with history and classicism that was really the core of Jenks's early project. And that oscillation between kind of classicism and conservatism in architecture and a more progressive, I think Banham will be read in part because within the field, he's sort of synonymous with always looking forward, not back. And however true that may or may not be, and however problematic that may be, I think he's sort of staked that out as his point of view.
Right, and then Jenks, of course, is somebody who makes the trip in the other direction. You know, still many in the Architectural Academy who think of him as being born in London and not in the United States, having gone
right.
the other direction. So let me see if there are other thoughts or questions from the panelists. And David, let me turn it back to you also if you have questions for folks before we look to the Q&A.
I think one thing I would add, or one thing I'd suggest, and I'm curious what you all think, is I think it's useful to look at Banham through two lenses. I mean, there's certainly the architectural lens or the architectural historian lens. I think there's also the kind of Los Angeles lens. And so for me, one of the reasons that the work continues to be resonant and I think will continue to be read in addition to kind of the electricity of the prose is that it represents a view of Los Angeles at a certain time, and in a city that, you know, sort of famously and kind of stereotypically forgets its history. I mean, you know, think about Norman Klein and, you know, the whole question of erasure, the history of forgetting. In a city that feels like that's one of those tropes, you know, Banham as a kind of observer of that moment kind of builds a platform for us to work off of. And I think that there will always be blind spots, even the notion of trying to write comprehensively about a city like Los Angeles, and then to do it in the way that he does it, which is so sort of idiosyncratically personal, kind of suggests what we're up against in terms of thinking about a progressive vision, and I don't mean politically progressive, but maybe that as well, but kind of a progression of ideas of Los Angeles and what they are. I mean, I think the book that we haven't talked about, which I think is very much in that lineage with Banham and Mike Davis, is Carrie McWilliams' Southern California Country and Island on the Land, which came out about 25 years before Banham. So I think that these things, in the same way that McWilliams, there's a lot in McWilliams, there are a lot of that he's missing. There's, you know, 25 years later, Banham fills in some gaps. 25 years after that, Mike fills in some gaps. There's stuff missing there as well. And so we keep filling in on the foundation that's being built. I wonder what you all think about that notion of that kind of progression of ideas.
Well, I think this came up in our preparatory conversation, which was, you know, we talk a lot about the ways in which Banham is in many ways historically constructing Los Angeles to be visible as a city type in ways that people couldn't see. When people couldn't see Los Angeles, he was giving it some kind of formation. And then we were sort of think, you know, I think I can't not historicize Banham, I guess, because he's so far away from me. And I can't not think about like Banham was the pre-era of globalization. And like now we're in the age of globalization. So I said this before, like what would be like, if Los Angeles was like the illegible city of like the 70s, like what are the cities that are illegible to a modern, you know, developed world, you know, like all of that the subject positions we're all in now, and who, you know, and what's a way of writing those cities ethically or writing those cities with some consciousness, you know, and then writing the figures. Like I think the question of access that Shumi, I don't know who brought this up, but Banham could not access the Chinese immigrant community of Los Angeles. So yes, he's not going to write it, right? But I'm again thinking towards the future, who are the people writing the stories of our cities and the cities globally? And what would a Banham-like lens or a Banham-like method that was not seeing Black communities and Black practitioners, and then like take that, and then like, what would he say about Shanghai? You know, what would that traveler's gaze, how I don't know, I'm just still thinking through these questions, like the traveler's gaze in cities that are the paradigms of our world today in the era of globalization. I would love to know like who's writing those stories. And I think I brought like Asian futurism as one example where there are people thinking about how like Asia becomes a future. Sorry, that was very rambling, but
No,
I
that's
was just
super
thinking through
helpful.
these questions.
No, that's super helpful, and I think a couple of things that you and others have touched on, the question of labor, you know, which is one way into these stories, and McWilliams. I'm glad that David mentioned McWilliams, and if you don't know that book, I highly recommend it. It's really, really good on the labor and race questions that McWilliams then that Banham then elides, you know, a generation later. So that can be a touchstone. And then I think this question of Hollywood too, of how, you know, the ways in which Los Angeles has reimagined itself in Asian cities, you know, continue to be a trope which have their own traps, but the ways in the way in which Shanghai, for example, stood in for Los Angeles of the near future and Her, or, you know, to say nothing of Blade Runner. So that might be a way in. And I do think, you know, Mike Davis, I sometimes wish Mike Davis had stayed around to grapple more with the changing Los Angeles, but he did apply that same thesis of City of Quartz to global cities and Planet of Slums, and looked at Dubai and looked at other places. I think pretty effectively, but I also kind of find myself wishing all the time that he were writing about Los Angeles of today. Let me jump in, anybody, as we wrap up. I just want to look quickly in the Q&A.
I think maybe just to kind of pick up on something like in what you were saying about who's writing futures and how do we write them and where are they being written. You know? It's just because I am involved in the academy so much, and I'm very much aware of the sort of constraints of what is valid in academic terms, and what that means for people who are trying to do quote unquote research, and what counts, you know, and what voices count. And often if things haven't been validated in a particular way, then that's one reason why that doesn't materialize in research. It maybe materializes in folk song, it maybe materializes in meme culture. I'm really making myself sound old now. But, you know, there are certain things that have not been validated by certain systems, and in us saying, well, they're not visible, I guess maybe we're saying, well, they're not visible here. Do we want to make them visible here? Is it not a kind of violence to say, well, you must only be looking at things that have this kind of documentation, that have this kind of history, that have this possibility for validation through the academy? Maybe there are other ways of looking and other places to look. And maybe that should be freed up for future scholars as well.
I think that's a beautiful statement, Shlomi, because I can't help but think about Jonathan Gold and his obsession with valorizing the culinary experience in Los Angeles, which later then becomes the perfect way to understand the urbanity and social dimension of Los Angeles without actually being trained as an cultural anthropologist or as an urbanist, but is co-opted by these spatial disciplines as a means of understanding and better relating to the city. And so for me, the Banham model also operates as a model to how to seek out alternative modes, not the car, the foot, not the academy, the street. And so for me, it's so exciting because one, I think the academy being at the beacon, at the top of the hill, it's no longer the game, the institutional like purveyor of information, is changing the dynamic for different kinds of histories to be written and different ways of writing those histories. And so I don't know, for me, we're in very exciting times. And it's an opportunity to do exactly the opposite of Banham in many ways.
I think that's a really great and beautiful, lovely place to end it, because we are a couple minutes over time. But I do think looking to that next generation of, I think, food writers, filmmakers, and we hope architecture critics as well that follow these figures will open up new ways of understanding the city. So I'm glad that, Victor, you're able to close us out. Let me thank all of you panelists for joining us today. This has been a terrific conversation, and I think has helped me understand the book in all kinds of new ways. And let me thank all of you who joined us today to get, at a certain point, more than 200 people talking about a 50-year-old book about architecture is no mean feat, and it's credit to the panelists whose reputations precede them. So thanks so much to you and the insight that you brought, and thanks all of you for joining today. Have a terrific weekend. Thanks so much.
Thank you.